Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's my privilege today to host Wally Adeyemo, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. The Honorable Mr. Adeyemo is a notable public servant who we're delighted to welcome back to the Peterson Institute, if only virtually. He'll be giving an update today heading into the upcoming G7, G20, IMF and World Bank spring meetings on the situation with sanctions of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where he and the US Treasury are playing a pivotal role, as well as placing it into the broader multilateral context in which, of course, the US government operates in the economic sphere. Just a word of insufficient biography for Wally. He's been Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury since March of last year. Just prior, he was the first president of the Obama Foundation. From 2015 to 2017, Adeyemo served in the Obama White House as Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. He also served as the President's representative to the G7 or G20, also known as the Sherpa, and held senior management positions at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, including as Deputy Chief of Staff, as well as Chief Negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership's provisions on macroeconomic policy. He holds a BA from the University of California at Berkeley and a JD from Yale Law School, which I believe remains the hardest one to get into. It's, of course, a little harder to become the Deputy Treasury Secretary, and we're all grateful to you, Wally, for your continued service to the U.S. government. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for having me. And thanks to the Peterson Institute for International Economics for hosting me virtually today, and in the past for hosting me in person. I look forward to doing that again soon. This week's spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank come at a pivotal moment for the international financial system and the global economy. Russia's brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine has catalyzed the kind of coordinated and multilateral response not seen since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The multilateral coalition President Biden has helped assemble is animated by a basic idea that you cannot violate the sovereignty of another country and continue to enjoy the privileges of integration into the global economy. A position reflected in our swift and decisive actions to counter Russia's aggression. The effects of our actions are already evident. Russia's economy is expected to contract by 10%, their worst contraction since Russia's economic crisis over 20 years ago. Russia has seen inflation spike, with the World Bank estimating inflation will reach 22% over the course of this year. Analysts forecast that imports could fall as much as 37%, and that domestic demand could decline over 11%. The economic crisis Russia faces will leave the Kremlin with fewer resources to prop up Russia's economy, pursue its invasion in Ukraine, and project power in the future. At the same time, we have taken pains to mitigate the impact of our actions on the global economy. This includes permitting energy market payments, as well as providing broad carve-outs for humanitarian, medical, and agricultural transactions. But despite our efforts, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its disruption of shipping lanes, and other destabilizing activity is the most significant headwind for the global economy since the initial pandemic-induced economic shock in March of 2020. It is against this backdrop that we gather this week. There have been few times in the last century when the operations and details of the international financial system have been so salient, especially during a military conflict. Today, I would like to share my thoughts on how we can continue to invest in a principle-based international financial system while also denying Russia its benefits. In response to US sanctions after Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Kremlin made the strategic decision to attempt to reduce Russia's dependence on the dollar in the US financial system. The Russian central bank moved $80 billion in assets outside the United States, made changes to its exchange rate regime, and built up its reserves to approximately $600 billion. Despite these attempts, to reduce reliance on the US financial system prior to the invasion, the dollar was still used in more than 80% of Russia's financial institutions' foreign exchange transactions. Yet the actions we have taken in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine this year are less about the centrality of the dollar and more about the impact of multilateral action. The financial sanctions, trade restrictions, and export controls put in place against Russia are being implemented by a coalition that includes more than 30 countries from around the globe, who represent more than 50% of the global economy, issuers of the world's most widely used convertible currencies, and producers of the world's cutting-edge technologies. The set of central bank actions that we've taken are a great example of the multilateral approach President Biden and Secretary Yellen have taken. The vast majority of Russia's central bank assets are held outside the United States, which meant building a coalition was essential to immobilizing the Kremlin's reserves. The depth and breadth of this multilateral coalition also strengthens our ability to enforce these sanctions going forward. The leaders of the G7 have made clear that we will take decisive actions to stop countries, companies, and individuals from helping Russia evade our sanctions. And we ultimately expect these actors will choose to follow our sanctions because the economic benefits of doing business with countries in our coalition, which represent more than half of the global economy, far outweigh the value of doing business with Russia's shrinking economy. But it's important for us to realize that Russia's actions today do not only threaten the peace and stability of Europe, they're having an impact on the global economy. As you know, Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of critical commodities. Russia's war of choice is disrupting supply chains, destroying Ukraine's crops, and creating uncertainty for energy markets. While we can take steps in the United States and other advanced economies to mitigate the impact of Russia's invasion on our citizens, developing economies are forced to pay a high cost for Russia's invasion of Ukraine as they face rising food and energy prices. This is why Secretary Yellen plans this week to call on policymakers to take steps to address the challenges Russia's invasion of Ukraine is creating for developing economies around the world. We must not allow Russia's invasion of Ukraine to further burden countries still struggling to deal with a global pandemic. Our ability to address Russia's invasion by using sanctions and providing support to those negatively impacted is only possible because of the investments we have made in the global financial system. And the only way to ensure the system becomes stronger is by continuing to invest in it. In the midst of World War II, a coalition of nations came together to do something unprecedented. They sought to build a true system for international economic exchange, one with rules that would promote fairness and shared global prosperity. While this system certainly has had its challenges, the results it has delivered have been nothing short of inspiring. For example, from 1955 to 2018, the global extreme poverty rate fell from about 50% to just 10%. The legacy of this effort is why we're all here today. The institutions created to safeguard this system and expand its scope by bringing new nations into this global economic coalition, including the IMF and World Bank. We're all here this week because we believe in the principles these institutions represent and the critical role economic cooperation will play in promoting global prosperity. In the last few weeks, we've heard criticism from some quarters that sanctions-based responses to Russia's actions risk the fracturing of the international economy. That by demonstrating the stark consequences of isolation from this system, we're encouraging our adversaries to accelerate their efforts to build a separate one. My takeaway is the opposite. That we have shown not only how indispensable the system is and how costly it is to be excluded from it, but also the futility of trying to avoid it. Russia's efforts to insulate itself from sanctions have failed because of the strength of the financial system we have collectively built. Like our predecessors, who built the Bretton Woods system during a moment of global conflict and crisis, now is the time to double down on our investments in a shared financial architecture, capable of promoting shared prosperity and holding rogue actors accountable. Let me conclude with a few words about where we go from here. To put it simply, as long as Russia's invasion continues, our sanctions will continue. Even as we continue to pursue rigorous financial sanctions against Russia and its key financial institutions, the next phase of our work will be to take apart Russia's war machine, piece by piece, by disrupting their military industrialized complex and its supply chain. Russia's war against Ukraine has taken far longer than Russia anticipated, due in large part to the heroic effort of the Ukrainian people and the support we have provided. That delay means that Russia's military will need to restock, resupply, and rebuild. To stop that from happening, we are continuing our efforts to use sanctions and export controls to deny Russia the critical inputs it needs, targeting key sectors like aerospace, electronics, and others related to the defense sector. As we continue to work with this coalition to address Russia's threat, now's the time to cement our cooperation and reinvigorate the international economic coordination on which the 20th century economy was built. If this conflict has taught us anything, it is that the dividends of our shared economic system come not only in the form of prosperity, but in the ability to defend our most sacred principles when needed to do that the most. Let me thank you again, Adam, for having me, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Secretary. I appreciate your concision, and I'm sure when working in the G7 and the G20, your colleagues appreciate it as well. Today is the first day, in addition to the important things, Mackerel Week at the Peterson Institute, and earlier today, we had your near counterpart, or Secretary Yellens' counterpart, Lawrence Wong, the Finance Minister of Singapore, speaking and addressing some of the same issues. So it's very great opportunity to be able to get multiple democratic government perspectives on these issues at this time. You mentioned the alliance, for want of a better word, sanctions on Russia, its financial system, its central bank, and the unprecedented scope. And I think you rightly emphasized that the scope is as much about the number of countries and governments involved as it is about the nature of the sanctions. One central banker off the record has observed to me, in essence, that what we're doing, though, is imposing financial instability on Russia. And as you sort of referenced, accepting whatever implications that may have, spillovers on other countries and other economies from so doing. So beyond what you think is happening now, how do you see governments collaborating on these kinds of financial sanctions in the future? Is there going to be an ongoing sort of leaders group, democracy group, UN group that's going to determine these things? Are there any guidelines you can give us or that you'd like to see adopted for when the US government and allied governments thinks it's okay to use sanctions on non-economic basis? Just where is this going, even if we all agree that it was the right thing to do for Russia's invasion?
Well, it's a great question, Adam. And as you know well, we have been using financial sanctions for long before I was at Treasury. And the reality was that at the Treasury Department, sanctions took on a prominent role in a different way after 9/11, when the terrorists attacked the World Trade Center. And what Secretary Yellen asked me to do when we were both nominated was she asked me to conduct a review of financial sanctions over the last 20 years. And that's exactly what I did when I was confirmed. And during that review, we didn't only look internally as to what we had done, but she asked me to talk to our allies and partners about what had worked when it came to financial sanctions over the previous 20 years and what we should do going forward, which formed the basis of many of the conversations we would later have in the year when it came to talking about what we would do if Russia were to invade Ukraine. I think some of the important lessons we learned from that review, which we published at the end of the last year, have animated the way we've thought about sanctions when it's come to Russia, and I expect it will animate the way we think about sanctions going forward. One is that a multilateral approach is always preferable whenever possible to a unilateral approach, both because of the economic consequences, and as I mentioned, when it came to Russia, we have formed a coalition that has included more than half of the global economy, but two, because politically isolates the adversary in a way that makes it harder for them to find a place to turn. Two is that it needs to be based on rigorous economic analysis to understand how you would maximize the impact on the target and minimize the impact on other economies. That's exactly what we've done when it's come to Russia. As I've mentioned during my opening remarks, in addition to taking actions that have had a significant impact on Russia's economy, we have made exemptions and had exceptions based on things that we knew that would be important to the global economy. For example, exempting agriculture products, allowing energy payments to continue, making sure that while we targeted the Kremlin's resources, we tried to limit the spillovers to the rest of the global economy. I think finally, the last point is that in order to make sure that these sanctions are effective, you need to make sure that you're dealing with evasion in a real way that will allow to ensure that the actors are not allowed to get around them. And the final point I'll make is that we always want to make sure that any sanctions that we put in place can at some point, if behavior changes, be reversed in order to make sure that the threat actor knows that when sanctions are put in place, the goal is behavioral change ultimately.
Well, thank you. And of course, I do recommend that people read the report you led, which Treasury published last year. But if I can draw you out a bit more on some of these issues, you mentioned multilateral. Of course, what multilateral often means is something where it is almost all countries in some formal structure. The coalition backing the sanctions is a huge majority of the world economy, but it's plurilateral in the jargon. It's not multilateral. And obviously, major economies from the G20 like China, India, Brazil have not lined up. So I just want to clarify on that. Is this going to be going forward a sanctions policy which will be coalitions of the willing built up on a case by case, or are you planning on thinking about some kind of further institutional or regime framework for imposing sanctions?
So Adam, I think that you're going to see both. Oftentimes, many of the sanctions regimes that we have advanced in the previously have been led by the United Nations, but you've also seen a number of sanctions in the past that have been led by coalitions of countries. And I think you will continue to see both of those things. And I think in the case, when you look at Russia, you're right that the grouping of countries represent the majority of the global economy and countries that are critical to certain things. For example, we knew that ultimately in order to deny Russia access to key technologies they needed, especially semiconductors, you only need a number of critical countries to do that, like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the United States, and the Dutch. The reality is that no other countries create the most advanced semiconductors in the world. So our coalition includes those countries. And we knew that in order to deny them access to convertible currencies of the major economies, you need to target certain other countries. And while we've seen those countries come together in what I would call the economic coalition that has held Russia accountable, you've seen in the UN also the vast majority of countries in votes that have been political in nature make clear to Russia that the actions they're taking in Ukraine to violate the sovereignty of another country is unacceptable. Our goal over time is to make sure that the political and the economic coalition in all countries in the world follow our sanctions, because that's the way we will have an impact on Russia. And as I said during my remarks, our expectations of the countries will, because ultimately the benefits of doing business with the broad coalition that we've built far outweigh the benefits of doing business with a shrinking Russian economy.
I think we all would agree with that. In Secretary Yellen's speech last week on these topics, she pretty explicitly called out China and that it is in its own interest, politically and economically, to support Russia less or call out Russia more. That said, empirically, as far as we can tell and the world can tell, Chinese companies and banks, and even to some degree the government, seems to be abiding by the sanctions that the economic coalition has put in place. So if you could just say a bit more about what is it realistic to expect from China, and how much you think that not asking you to speak obviously for the Chinese Communist Party, but how much you think China's leadership is being affected by the threat of secondary sanctions versus the political will of the world to stand up for sovereignty, or just and why do you feel, or does Secretary Yellen feel comfortable asking China to go more than just not violate the sanctions, I guess?
So I can't speak for what is influencing the Chinese Communist Party or its leaders. What I can tell you is that China has in the past, and we expect them to continue to follow the sanctions regimes that have been introduced by us and the coalition that we've built, for the same basic reason of every other country. China's business with the rest of the world is far greater than its business with Russia. Chinese firms have traditionally followed these sanctions, and we expect them to do that in the future like every other country. But we also believe that China has interest in stability because China is being forced to pay the high energy prices that are being created by this conflict. China has always said that they stood up for sovereignty and the respect for sovereignty. That's why Secretary Yellen and other leaders have called on China to call on Russia to end this invasion as soon as possible. Ultimately, doing so is not only to the benefit of those who are in Europe, but is to the benefit of all global economies and countries around the world. That's why we're calling on China to take these steps going forward.
At what point, thank you very much, Wally. At what point do you start to worry about U.S. extraterritorial or foreign policy motivated application of sanctions losing you a coalition? Again, credit to Secretary Yellen, to you, to President Biden, Secretary Blinken, for assembling a very powerful coalition on short order in this situation. And obviously, like you said, there's always going to be ad hoc adjustments, but just generally, how does it play in your mind at Treasury of worries about overuse of sanctions, or when you're able to get this kind of coalition together?
It's a great question. I think one of the things to talk about when it comes to the formation of this coalition is that one of the things the president called on us to do early on was to share information with our allies and partners about what we saw with regard to the intelligence on Russia's troop buildup on the border of Ukraine. And we started doing that in November of last year. And that provided us with the credibility to start having conversations about what we would do in response if Russia actually decided to invade. And what we found is that our partners and our allies have been unified in the idea that they want to ensure that the invasion ends, both because of the impact it has on sovereignty, but because of the impact it has on the global economy and on the values, norms, and rules that we have all stood for since World War II. My view is that as long as we continue to consult and work closely with this coalition, and we recognize that different countries are in different positions to take different actions, and that we take those actions wherever possible in coordination and in collaboration, we should have a unity of the coalition should remain together and remain strong. The truth is that the impact of Russia's actions in Ukraine on the global economy and all of our countries is something that we need to mitigate together. And by acting together, one of the things that we learned from our review, and countries are learning as we do this, we're in a better position to mitigate the risks of the actions that we're taking vis-a-vis Russia, and also to mitigate the risks that are being created by Russia's invasion in Ukraine. The food security challenge, for example, that the world faces today is one that isn't only faced in Europe, it's being faced in Africa, it's being faced in the Middle East, it's being faced by all of us because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and because many of those commodity prices are global. So being able to address the challenges we face, not only using sanctions and export controls, but using institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the MDBs that we created after World War II is going to be essential to keeping this coalition together, showing that we can not only use the coalition to go after a rogue actor, but also use the coalition to promote prosperity in our countries and around the world, I think is going to be a key piece of our efforts to demonstrate to this coalition the importance of the system we've created and the importance of us working together to hold Russia accountable for violating the rules, norms, and values of the system that we've all created.
Thank you very much, Wally. There are several issues you raised that I also would like to ask you for more on. Starting with the issue of hunger and energy prices, or food prices and energy prices in the developing world. Clearly, I will say that for all the good intentions, the G7 did not do very well by the developing world in terms of COVID, in terms of vaccine provision, in terms of medical aid and supplies. And so far, at least, as people at the World Bank and the IMF have pointed out, doesn't seem to be very mobilized about the potential food shortages and disruptions in the developing world. I mean, again, we all know the very real life fact that parts of North Africa, notably Egypt, are very dependent on Ukrainian wheat, and it's hard to substitute for that in the short term. So you, Secretary Yellen, have mentioned these things, but I don't get the sense that they're at the top of the G20 or G7 agenda going into this week, or that there's a deliverable coming out. Obviously, it's easy for me, fat and happy in my cheap seat, to raise this, but it has to be raised. What actually is the rich world going to do for hungry people and people still lacking vaccinations in the developing world, since not that much has been done yet?
So let me start out by acknowledging that you're right, that Ukraine is the breadbasket not only to Europe, but to much of North Africa and to the Middle East. And that the reason that people are worried about wheat shipments being unable to get out of Ukraine is because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's important for those people in those countries to realize that you can't sit on the sidelines here, because what Russia is doing to Ukraine not only has impact in terms of violations of sovereignty, but it has a real economic impact on each one of your countries. And tomorrow, Secretary Yellen is going to pull together a grouping of finance ministers, leaders of multilateral development banks, and other institutions to talk about how we're going to use the resources of the system that we help build to help address this challenge. I think you're right that one of the things that we have to do is take practical steps to demonstrate that this system is helping the people who need it the most. And that is what the Secretary plans to focus on this week, to focus on the crisis and what we're going to do to both support Ukraine economically, but also use our sanctions tools to hold Russia accountable, but also to focus on those countries that are struggling to pay for things like bread for their people in light of the increase in commodities prices. I think you are right that early on during COVID-19, instead of the world coming together to deal with this globally, we decided to take steps that would shut down our borders and would deny people access to medicines. But I think that's changed. And I think President Biden played a big role in that changing. A year ago, not even a year ago now, the president at the G7 sat down with leaders and agreed to providing billions of dollars of resources to help poor countries deal with COVID, as well as to provide vaccinations. There's more that we need to do. We need to stay focused on making sure the developing world has the resources they need to address COVID, to also address climate change. And the best way to do that is both by pulling together our countries, but frankly, to make sure the institutions that we've built, like the World Bank and the IMF, are taking steps to do so. While early on, we didn't do enough to address these crises, over the last several years, hundreds of billions of dollars have come from the IMF and the World Bank to address the COVID-19 crisis and go to countries. The United States has called for debt relief for countries that are facing debt challenges because of their need to deal with the budgetary issues that have come out of COVID-19. So I do think that you're right that there's more that we need to do. These are going to be part of the conversations during the IMF World Bank meetings, and we can't lose track of these crises as we're dealing with the crisis that has been created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. We still fortunately have a bit more time, but just to say, I'm glad to hear that you and Secretary Yellen are convening with that in mind. Just to push that point further, though, you say it's the institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. I would add the multilateral development banks. I would add the WTO. Of course, you would too. But just to say, we've been batting around this term international financial architecture really since the 1997 crisis. And nothing much seems to have changed on that, including US payment of quotas and US and European vote shares at the fund and the bank. Inside the US, we have a very active discussion about the idea that representation matters, that certain issues don't come out unless you have the right people at the table. The economics profession has suffered spots of blindness because we have not had the right people at the table. Too many people look just like me. In terms of international governance at these major institutions, should there be a change there to get the issues of what happens in the developing world more responded to than it's regularly been?
So I have to agree with you, Adam, that making sure that the institutions reflect the diversity of the global economy is an important thing. And you're right to point out that in addition to the World Bank and IMF, we're also talking about the multilateral development banks as well as the WTO. And you see the new head of the WTO comes from one of these developing economies, Nigeria. And you look at the first deputy at the IMF, someone who has come, who's an American citizen, but of Indian descent. And I think it is critical that we have diversity in these institutions because it helps ensure that conversations from all perspectives are happening at those institutions. And ultimately, the truth is that the countries who make up these institutions. And it's important to remember that when the IMF started, it had fewer than 30 countries as part of the IMF. Over time, more than 190 countries have joined the IMF because of the basic proposition that the IMF was built around helping to build a sense of shared prosperity. In order for the IMF and these international financial institutions to remain relevant into the future, we have to make sure that we're addressing the crises that we face today, from COVID-19 to climate change, and we're doing it in a way that I would say is equitable, where we're helping those people who need help the most. And that's a big focus of President Biden's agenda, the Secretary's agenda. And we know it's something that the leaders of the international financial institutions support. But to your point, the goal for us is that the international financial architecture needs to adapt and change as the world changes. And that's something that we're committed to working on.
Great, thank you. Going back to something you said a moment ago, and which I know is consistent in your and the department's work about trying to design sanctions that are targeted and minimize unfortunate spillovers on other countries, including your allies, our allies. We're all very aware that Germany, Italy, Austria, and a couple other countries are heavily dependent on Russian oil and particularly natural gas due to long-term commitments and pipelines and such. And therefore, there has been an unwillingness on the part of Germany and other European economies who are free riding on Germany to say, we're not going to go there on sanctions. At the same time, there's a big pushback, including from Kiev, from the leadership in Ukraine, but also, frankly, within Germany and Italy, domestically, on stopping sanctions at that point. How do you see this? How does the US government rather see this? Is it just a reality that we can't go faster than Germany and Italy want us to? Is it something that Germany and Italy and others you would hope would reconsider if the war is going to continue? Or does the US government have no opinion on this state of affairs?
So I appreciate the question, Adam, because I think it gives me a chance to just speak about where we've come. And before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was a debate in our country about what to do about Nord Stream 2, which was Russia's pipeline that went around Ukraine and serviced Germany. And when the invasion started, Germany took the action to stop Nord Stream 2 and that pipeline. And we've seen that Europe, despite being differently situated than the United States, has taken action to cut themselves off from Russian energy already. A week ago, Europe announced a ban on Russian coal, which will have an impact on their economy. But like America, and like the rest of the world, Europe has decided that they're going to take steps that may be painful for them in order to stand up for their values. We're, of course, differently situated than Europe when it comes to energy. We produce more energy than we need here in the United States, and that allows us to be in a position to export some of our energy abroad. A few weeks ago, President Biden had a chance to meet in Europe with the G7 and also to meet with European leaders. And there we made a commitment to working with them to provide them with LNG resources from the United States in order to make up for some of the resources that they will lose as they work to reduce their dependence on Russian energy, mainly oil and gas over time. Europe doing this over time is something that is critical to them because they know that by reducing their dependence on Russian oil and energy, it hurts the Kremlin and it puts them in a position to be independent of the whims of President Putin. We want to support them in these efforts. We want to do everything we can in the United States to, over the short term, increase our production in order to put us in a position to better supply the market so that Europe is better able to move away from Russian oil and gas. The thing we have to remember, though, is that ultimately, as you know, Adam, global oil markets are global. So the next time that President Putin or someone else who controls oil decides to launch an invasion, we again will deal with volatility in the energy markets. That's why moving to clean energy alternatives is not only a priority for us from the standpoint of climate change in the United States, but it's also a national security priority for us to move to a clean energy future. That's why the president's committed to it. That's why the European leaders are committed to it. It'll take longer than the transition that Europe wants to make away from Russian gas and energy, but we recognize that doing so will put us in a better position to control our future as well.
Thank you. So that's a great bridge to us talking a bit more long-term, which I know in your role as Deputy Secretary, you have to balance the immediate crises and the longer-term thinking. So if we look forward to a world in which there will be sustained increases in carbon prices and changes in technology, and in a world in which there likely would have to be sustained public investment in various forms of research and infrastructure to facilitate green technology, how should this be managed fiscally? I mean, can we just write a check as we've been doing and just keep funding it as we go? Should there be a separate capital budget? Should there be other kinds of taxes and transfers? I mean, at this point in your thinking, and especially given the nature of the US budgeting process, how does the Treasury, how do you think about financing the green transition?
It's a great question. And as Adam, you know, and all of your Americans who are watching this know, today in America is tax day. Americans today are filing their taxes. And while we know that we need to potentially increase taxes modestly in our country, one of the things that we can do simply to help raise revenue in our country is enforce the tax laws that are on the books. One of the things that Secretary Yellen, the president, have called for is a modest investment in our Internal Revenue Service that over a 10-year period would bring in $400 billion in revenue. And then after the next 10 years would bring in more than $1 trillion in revenue. So I do think, to your point, Adam, one of the things we need to do is think about how we pay for some of the things that we are looking to make investments in over time. I think we have lots of options to do that, including by implementing the International Tax Agreement that was, to your point, a multilateral agreement that was reached throughout the world, but would not only in the United States help us raise revenue, but would help a number of the countries that face challenges today raise revenues too going forward. So I do think that from our standpoint, it's critical that we raise revenues to not only pay for a number of the things the president has proposed, including a significant increase in the money that we invest in our clean energy future, but also pay for a number of other things that are critical to making investments in American competitiveness and expanding the capacity of the US economy. We have the ability to do that. We have the ability to implement the president's modest changes to our tax system that will increase revenue, decreasing our deficit, in a way that helps us be more sustainable over time while also making targeted investments in our economy. That's exactly what the president has called for. We know more now than ever, making the investments in the clean energy transition is critical not only to to addressing climate change and our national security, but also is a ability for us to invest in our competitiveness, given that this is the direction that the world is going in. So those are the things that we want to do, but we recognize that we also have a responsibility to find ways to pay for these things, and also over time to pay for a number of the other ideas we have to invest in our economy.
I will just say, as I've said on the record many times before, I commend Secretary Yellen for her leadership on bringing the international tax negotiations to a close, a positive close, and I continue to hope that the U.S. Senate will take up its responsibility and pass that. But that's just my editorializing. Let me turn to another long-term issue, if I could, Wally. There's a lot of chatter around, and a lot of pundits, ranging from me to others, who have to confront the idea that maybe this is a turning point in the dollar's popularity or the dollar's reserve role, that once the U.S. is busy imposing this kind of financial sanctions, including on utility effectively of central bank reserves, that maybe people will have an incentive, or other countries will have an incentive, to have an alternative to the dollar, an alternative payment system to SWIFT, an alternative reserve currency. Obviously, it's your job to say that's nonsense, but beyond saying that's nonsense, could you say a bit more about how you see the sanctions regime, but also more general developments in terms of the US dollar's role in the global financial system?
So Adam, you're right that my view is that that is unlikely to happen, but that's because you have to step back and think about why is the US dollar the global reserve currency? I think it has to do with a number of things that we have done domestically. We have the deepest, most liquid capital markets in the world. We have the world's most complex, significant economy. And as long as we continue to make the investments like the ones we just talked about in America's future, and the economy remains dynamic, and people continue to want to invest in the United States, and we continue to have a stable set of laws in this country, I expect that the dollar will remain the most dominant currency in the world. The risk that we take when we take sanctions is that we do in some ways drive bad actors to think about alternative methods of getting around the dollar. And that's another reason why a multilateral approach, or an approach that involves coalitions, is so important. When you think about it, outside of the G7, there aren't a lot of convertible major currencies out there. So part of the reason the president was so focused on making sure that the actions we took with regard to Russia involved our closest allies and partners was to ensure that this wasn't just seen as an action that the United States was taking, or that we were taking based on the power of the dollar, but it was one that all the countries that control the world's most liquid, most convertible currencies were also taking, was critical to making sure that we not only protected the dollar's role, but that we helped to protect the entire international system. And the reason that I think that it's important for us to recognize that the dollar is going to remain ubiquitous, even for countries that are attempting to escape it, is that you look at Russia. Russia had taken every action since the invasion in 2014 to get away from the dollar, including moving their reserves out of this country. Yet Russian financial institutions that were transacting around the world, trying to sell and buy goods and assisting their companies in doing that, 80% of their foreign exchange transactions still involve the US dollar, even though that country was trying to move away from the American economy. So my sense is that while it's going to be important that we continue to make important investments domestically to make sure that the US economy remains robust and a place where capital continues to want to flow, we have a great deal of advantages that put us in a position where we can use tools like financial sanctions to help protect our national security. But we need to do it in a way that is deliberate and that whenever possible involves other countries in order to both have a significant economic impact, but also to send a clear political message to those that threaten our national security.
Final question, and I know you have many other duties, so thank you again for being with us here at the Peterson Institute and our global audience. In places well outside of Washington, like Miami, there are gatherings of people who think of not alternative national currencies, but alternative currencies, period. Cyber and cryptocurrencies, where part of their value proposition is to say, we don't want to be expropriated by government, and they can cite what's going on right now for certain conspiratorial mindsets as an example of just what a cyber currency is meant to avoid. How is the Treasury thinking about enforcing sanctions if people start trying to use those kinds of alternative currencies, both for payment and as stores of value?
It's an important question, Adam, and I think one of the things that we know is that innovation is happening throughout the payments ecosystem. Crypto is one of those innovations, and one of the things that we are very focused on, working not only here in the United States, but again, working across the Financial Action Task Force and that multilateral organization, is making sure that we have a regulatory architecture that puts us in a place to ensure that crypto is not used as a means of evasion more so than other payment systems. I think what we have done over the course of the last several months and years is to ensure that we are starting to establish those rules of the road that will mean that crypto, like other means of payments, have to follow some of the key bedrock principles that exist for protecting against illicit finance. Over the course of the last several months, even before the Russia-Ukraine invasion, we've taken some actions against crypto exchanges, for example, that have been found to primarily provide avenues for illicit finance by sanctioning them. And one of the things that's important to remember is that for many of these exchanges, they have an off-ramp and an on-ramp that includes the use of fiat currency. And for most people who buy a token, at some point, they're going to want some kind of fiat currency. And similar to other people in the world, they usually are going to want a convertible currency that belongs to one of our closest allies and partners. So we're very focused on making sure that those countries, their financial institutions, the ecosystem around crypto are following the rules of the road that help to regulate illicit finance going forward, and that we are building up the technological expertise needed to be able to track that type of money. In addition to our sanctions review earlier this year, covering what we can do to better implement sanctions, there was also a focus on what we can do to make sure that we're keeping up with advances in technology going forward. And part of that is making sure that we bring in the type of expertise that's needed to make sure that we understand where cryptocurrency, where central bank digital currencies are going, in order to ensure that we're in a position to use these tools to continue to protect our national security going forward. I feel confident in our ability to do that, largely because the vast majority of crypto is in hosted wallets and often wants to find a way to off-ramp or on-ramp using a major currency. But it's going to require us to continue to innovate here at Treasury, but also around the world. This gets back to the point that I led with. Ultimately, cryptocurrency, like so many things around the world, is a global phenomenon. In order for us to address a global phenomenon like this, we need to do it with other countries around the world. That's why we think working through the Financial Action Task Force with FATF is going to be critical to multilateral action to make sure that cryptocurrencies don't become a major source of evasion going forward. And when we build an environment that allows responsible innovation in payments and in other financial products as well.
Terrific. Well, we will continue our tour of voices from around the world tomorrow in PIIE Macro Week, when at 12:30 Eastern, Thomas Jordan, chairman of the Swiss National Bank, and at 3 p.m. Eastern, when Spanish Vice President Nadia Calvino, the chair of the IMFC, both will be speaking at the Peterson Institute, just as we had today the honor of hosting Singaporean Finance Minister Lawrence Wong, and importantly, stimulatingly, I might even go so far as to say inspiringly, just now, Wally Adeyemo, the Deputy Secretary of the United States Treasury. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Take care.
Be well.